Let's talk security, current affairs, governance, politics, your view, elections, rule of law, economic issues, foreign events on the Talking Point. Talking Point, weekdays on this channel.
Determine the expressions of freedom and human rights.
So news greeted us today, especially with regards to the situation involving the NNPCL and major marketers. In 2023, we had predominantly issues of market forces. That was between the NNPCL and major marketers. So, quoting the punch of today, NNPCL marketers clash over subsidy operators peg, which they're looking for to peg in petrol at 1,200 naira per litre. It is important that before I continue with this conversation that I let you know a little background to what we're talking about today. The Nigerian National Petroleum Company, reading from the Punch of today, Limited, and fuel marketers under the aegis of the Independent Petroleum Marketers Association of Nigeria on Tuesday clashed again over the removal of subsidy on petrol. This came against the backdrop of the depreciation of the naira against the United States dollars at both the official investors and exporters window at the parallel market. Follow me, please. I'm going somewhere. On the back of the falling naira rate, economists and marketers and PMS subsidy was increasing in recent times. But the NNPCL quickly countered these positions and declared that it was recovering from full cost on the importation of premium motor spirit, popularly called petrol, countering the positions, especially on the issue of fuel subsidy. In 2023, we heard a lot about the issue of subsidy until the president, upon assumption of office, announced the removal of fuel subsidy. And in the last administration, we had also had that there was a provision for subsidy payment to a certain level, at least some months, before the subsidy was going to be removed. Following the headline from the Punch, with a couple of papers captured succinctly, this of petrol price, that is where we are going to. If you look on your screen, you have that paper talking about the Punch of today. NNPCL, marketers clash over subsidy, operators peg petrol at 1,200 naira per litre. What are the forces responsible for price determination? Why can we not have a definitive, as it were, price? Because Nigerians are already grappling with the fluctuating price, which many times the NNPCL, Group GMD, Military, has said market forces determine the pricing. And so today we want to examine the root cause of this back and forth as to pricing. What is exactly responsible? From the marketing point, they have their excuse. From the NNPCL, they have their excuse. That being the case, welcome to Talking Point. My name is Ike Chukwu Jue. So today we're going to be looking at the back and forth between the NNPCL and major marketers so that we know where the problem is coming from. My guest today will be joining me virtually, and he is an oil and gas expert. He himself is an engineer in the petroleum industry. Joining me all the way this afternoon from where he is in his base in Lagos today is Dr. Wisdom Enang. The last time I had him on the show, we were talking about the possibility of meeting the deadline, and after the deadline was met by the Tinubu-led administration, when they announced to us that they had already started phase of rehabilitation of the Port Harcourt refinery. Joining me is Dr. Wisdom Enang. Dr. Wisdom, you're welcome, and a Happy New Year to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Happy New Year to you, sir.
It's a pleasure to have you on the program today.
Thank you.
So, Wisdom, without much ado, quoting the Punch newspaper of today, and that back and forth between the NNPCL and major marketers over this issue of pricing, the pegging of the price, especially with this issue of subsidy or no subsidy. The president was categorical. Subsidy is gone. Why are we having issues with pricing? Dr. Wisdom, you're a player in this industry. Can you help us?
Absolutely. So the first and important thing that we want to find out and understand properly is the fact that when the federal government says subsidy is over, what they're trying to talk about is the fact that they are not underpaying below the cost it takes to actually land the product. And it is important to understand that is what subsidy implies. Now, on the other hand, when the marketers are talking about the cost, saying that the pricing should be a bit different, they are actually assuming a number of factors for which they don't have control. So, and they don't actually understand how the dynamics of those factors work. The first thing is, when the marketers are saying the first should get to 1.2, two things come to mind. They're quoting the ever-increasing price of crude oil, and they're also quoting the exchange rates. But the interesting thing is, both factors are factors that we can, in fact, within the federal government purview. And the federal government can adjust those factors or can adjust their way around those factors. I think that's the best word to put it. So things like the exchange rates, the marketers are using the black market, but they haven't been able to, they don't know for certain what the federal government is issuing those, the foreign currencies to NNPC at what exchange rate. They don't know that. The second thing is, they don't also know the agreements that are getting to, we're a producing nation, and they don't know the agreements that the federal government get into in order to ensure that they reduce the price of the feedstock, towards wherever we're refining our products and bringing them back in, and that then comes in as a reduced cost in terms of the final products. So what that means is, I understand the position of the independent marketers. They are saying, if you want us to import petroleum, PMS, into the country, it would need to be at least 1,200. But the federal government is saying, well, even at the cost of importation, which translates to the cost of sales, which ranges between 585 somewhere in Lagos, all the way to about 600 and I think 95 in places in Akwa Ibom, that they still recover their costs. But you see, economies of scale is a very important factor in determining those costs. And you would understand that the NNPC plays at a very high economies of scale compared to the local average importer. So you can understand that they're looking at different perspectives. But I would like to agree that the NNPC's position is actually valid based on the economies of scale and the adjustment of factors within their control and the government's control, that they can still recover their costs by importing and selling at about 595 somewhere in Lagos and all the way to what it is in Akwa Ibom, without actually paying subsidy, which in this case is defined as the paying the differential between your selling cost and the cost price. Before now, we were paying that much because the selling price was way, way lower than the cost of landing petroleum products.
Okay, so Dr. Wisdom, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I need clarity so that the viewer, the ordinary Nigerian, can be perfectly educated here. There are three things you've mentioned, and I need clarity. Subsidy is gone. That's the president's announcement. So why are we hearing about subsidy again? Is it that there is still some kind of subsidy, or is there another subsidy introduced somewhere along the line? That's one. Two, landing costs. We heard a lot about landing costs in 2023. We're hearing it again in 2024. Can you help us understand this landing cost and why it is resurfacing so that it's now determining pricing, please?
Yeah, I mean, landing cost has always been there. You cannot shy away from the, understanding that whatever you sell your product at needs to take care of your cost. And in this case, the cost of actually bringing in the product, whether it be refining cost plus the logistics all the way into the shores of Nigeria, That is what classes as landing cost, and it is the price determinant for how we eventually sell, the main determinant for how we eventually sell our petroleum products. Now, the issue of subsidy, as I said, in this federal government's context, has to do with the, the selling price. The federal government augmenting the selling price, which was way below the cost price, and that was what the federal government says, that subsidy is out. Meaning, if it costs 800 naira to land this product, and then we add the reasonable cost to cover all the logistics to the various zones and storage to the various zones and administrative costs in the country, then we would sell it below 800. That's what it simply means. So in every argument that the experts are arguing, no one fails to say, okay, the federal government has introduced subsidy because the landing cost is way above the amount that we're selling it. No one has said that. What everyone is saying is that the price of crude and the exchange rate in the black market do not permit the sales price that we're currently operating at the pump at the moment. But we need to understand that within the socialist welfare system that the government intends to run to balance things between, of course, governance in the capitalist sense and the social welfare of the people, that they can adjust, as I said, they can give preferential exchange rates for such commodities. There's nothing wrong with that. That is a way of actually ring-fencing that sector from a sort of an uncontrolled inflation. So what the independent marketers do not understand is the deployment of the techniques that the federal government has put in place to ensure that there is price control. Now, let me say something. I have said times without number, we are not running a free market system in the downstream sector. I would like to say that we're running more of a floating peg. The floating peg is where we put a peg that at least covers the landing cost plus a few other administrative costs to distribute this petroleum product to the various user centers. However, it is not a free market. A free market is where the market forces, assuming and taking cognizance of different factors, can determine the price. It's true that if we free that market, we will be paying 1,200 naira per liter. However, that is taking the worst case scenario, that you have the prevalent high cost of crude still remains valid even at the import scenario. We still have the exchange rate at the worst case in the black market applied. But what I can tell you is that through contractual agreements, I believe the federal government has been able to work around these two most important price determining factors to ensure that we do have a landing cost that is well below what we sell at the pump price, so they recover their costs.
These explanations are, for me, as a layman, very technical, and I have a bit of a problem because it's very technical. However, how can all of this, quote, imbroglio be averted? Because we cannot continue to go back and forth. What Nigerians are after is affordability and availability. Now, how do we address the issue of affordability? Does it have anything to do with our refineries? Does it have anything to do with refining and still importing? Because we need to make sense of this conversation. My interest, as well as every other Nigerian's interest, is affordability, because Nigerians are complaining at the moment at the current price, let alone pegging it at 1,200.
All right, fantastic. So the first thing that we need to know is when you put a policy in place, there are maturation and incubation and maturation phases to that policy. And this is very important to understand. Now, why does that matter? While you're waiting for your policy to incubate and mature, you also need to put a stopgap plan. And the federal government, just to bring it down to the common person, has in their wisdom put in a floating peg mechanism, which I've just explained previously, to ensure that the worst case that people are predicting of petrol being sold at 1,200 naira per liter is averted. That's a stopgap plan. The ultimate plan is the money that we have recovered from savings and from subsidy. We didn't now need to start putting that money towards getting the refineries back up working. And in getting the refineries back working, we need to understand that there are various imperatives. It's not just about the money. The supply situation is very important. As I said, we need to get a lot more consistent supply of crude to the various refineries. I'm going to take the Dangote refinery, for example. We're hearing that they've taken, I think, their fourth consignment of 1 million barrels of crude for refining. And, I don't like the piecemeal approach, and that's simply because there is no guarantee of supply in the long term with that piecemeal approach. I would have loved an approach where we now know that there is there's a commitment with a supplier of perhaps an international oil and gas company, an IOC, to supply the Dangote refinery for the next 10 years. Those are the questions that are, the sort of imperatives, rather, that I'd like to be put in place. Now, speaking of the supply situation again, some of the terms that we had, we read that they were fed with a lesser capacity of crude than they ought to be fed with, and that led to it operating under its required capacity, and of course the manufacturer's operating envelope. So those are the things we see. Now we're also hearing that the NLNG are complaining that they cannot imagine a phase 8 to the NLNG plant because they are getting less than 60% of the gas that they actually need to run at full capacity. So, you see that the capacity, the supply situation is actually a huge problem that is featuring across the entire gas and downstream sector. So I think the stopgap plan is apt. Yes, let's get out subsidy, but let's use a floating peg rather than a free market system. If anyone is under the illusion that we're running a free market system in downstream sector, that's wrong. It's a floating peg that makes sure that we do not pay subsidies, which is the differential between the lesser selling price, which was obtainable before, and the higher cost landing cost. So what does that mean in quotes? Is under the regime of the transition regime, of course, which is what we're currently having, the stopgap plan, the downstream folks are going to make marginal profits. They're not going to make as massive a profit as if it was a free market system where they can come together and determine price. Let's not forget that in Nigeria today, a lot of things are controlled by some of those organized labor unions. So they can come together and decide that they want to sell at 1,002. If the federal government, in their wisdom, were not coming up with these protective clauses for consumer protection, then, of course, we will have to bow to the pressure of these organized, labor unions and sectors. So let's thank the federal government for what they're doing. But looking forward, I think, in addition to channeling money to refine more, to build those, rejuvenate those refineries, we need to start thinking about the contractual agreements that will ensure the long-term supply, which is a key imperative that we need to ensure that we have the availability of PMS in the long term, and then the price modulating effect in the long term as well for our downstream sector.
Your analysis is very well explained. I must commend you for that explanation. However, from your analysis, I've drawn out a few things that I'd like clarity on as well. You've talked about the imperatives of supply. You've talked about the encumbrance we've been having. You also questioned why we're having the piecemeal supply to Dangote refinery, which at the moment is functional, whilst we prepare for that of the Port Harcourt refineries. Now, you said in your analysis that you would prefer some kind of contractual agreement where, say, for example, the Dangote refinery gets, say, a 10-year supply. Now, let's talk about that issue, that supply problem. Why do we have that? Is it that we do not have enough oil to supply, as it were, enough crude? Or that we don't have these companies to sign the agreement with that we're having this piecemeal? Because when the Port Harcourt refinery gets fully operational, before we talk about the Kaduna and the rest of them, this issue of supply is going to be a problem because that led to many TAMs that we've had. How can this issue of supply be best addressed?
All right, so I think it is important for us to first contextualize the supply situation that we have at the moment. First and foremost, I like to state in the upstream sector, there are two main contracts, which are the joint venture contracts, for which the government owns about 60% of those fields, and they're mainly in the they're mainly onshore and the shallow water offshore. However, the deep water contracts, on the other hand, what we call the production sharing contracts, the government doesn't actually own the crude. What the government take is their royalties and taxes. It is the company that decide what they do. What am I trying to explain? I'm trying to say in simple terms that Nigeria only can take credit for only about 30 to 40% of its crude volumes, just because of the contract, the way the contract was being laid out. And these contracts are not yearly. These contracts are, minimum 10 years. Now, that being said, when we eventually get the crude, whatever 60% from the JV, joint venture, that accrues to the Nigerian government, the Nigerian government has also had several agreements. So there are forward contracts, which simply means, that you tell, let's say, a body like World Bank to say, give us some money. What we're going to do, our future sales are going to be committed of crude, are going to be committed towards paying back the money that you gave to us. And there was also what we call the crude swap contracts, whereby previously you would take those crude volumes and swap them for refined products. Okay, so the reason I had to contextualize this is that the volumes that we, having cognizance of the fact that we are not expanding our exploration and production as much as we should. A lot of the fields that we have been producing in the last 40 years are fields that were actually, explored, drilled, and capped in the early, the late 70s and early 80s. And so we need to understand that. Now, taking that into account, the only thing that, is we can do in the immediate term to get volumes is, one, scrapping some of those crude swap contracts. You cannot scrap the forward contract, because those forward contracts are backed, they're kind of linked to a loan which you have gotten and used. So you cannot cancel that one. But the crude swap to refined products, you can cancel that. What am I saying in essence is that when you take into account of this, you find out that you cannot at this point in time make commitments on a continuous volume. You can only say, well, after XYZ period, this is the volume we can have. Okay, Dangote Refinery, take that volume and get on with it. The only thing I would say is canceling the crude swap agreement is a first step. I think we need to boost our production as a second step. As I said, there are several variables and there are several constants. We know very well that we cannot cancel those forward contracts that are tied to loans. We cannot do that. However, we can boost our production in order to be able to have enough to meet the forward contract commitments, still make sales to get the effects that is much needed, and still have enough for the domestic supply obligations. So I think that the federal government needs to charge companies to come up with their production expansion plans. And this, I'm talking about at least a 50% increase in the current base rates. That is when we can have enough of supply. But the supply situation at the moment is very epileptic. The second imperative that we need to do is that we need to put in place long-term logistics for the supply. It's not enough that when the tankers are available, you send in 1 million barrels every other few weeks. So what happens if we burn through that 1 million barrels in a couple of days? That's the question to ask. People perceive the idea of a pipeline But with the whole pipeline insecurity problem that we're having over 100 hot tap along different pipelines in the in the Niger Delta, that is not a plan I would like to go at the moment. But we need to set up more of a long-term logistics plan and boost our production. It's interesting to see that the NUPRC are targeting above 2 million barrels of production a day. That's really, really interesting. I just hope that they put, they match their words with actions, because that's exactly what would translate to us having the required supply volumes for the domestic supply, to fix the domestic supply situation that we have at the moment.
Dr. Wisdom, let me ask another very important question, because you've talked about logistics, and over time we've had this conversation about logistics. Does this logistics problem, as it were, play any role whatsoever in determining pricing? And if it does, what can be done in that regard? One question. Second, what should the IOCs be doing to help boost our production capacity?
Okay, I have a personal bias for the second question, so I'll start there. Okay, so this is a very interesting times because this is where we begin to have the conversation around IOCs looking at divesting. So I know you're sitting there as a Nigerian thinking, well, is it not an oxymoron that we're thinking about an IOCs that are thinking about divesting at the same time we're asking them to boost production? And this is where the federal government needs to put their foot down. If you're going to divest, fantastic, but whoever is taking over, you need to show those expansion plans for developing the various fields. Now, let me just put it to the average person. The IOCs have a number of fields, and the field licenses are renewed in clusters. They actually are not renewed on a singular basis. Okay. What this means is that we could have a cluster of fields, maybe 15 fields in one license, and only 4 are producing, for the IOCs. And the question is, why do we have the differential of about 11 that are on that license being renewed and not being produced? And that's what the federal government needs to do. If you're only coming for 4 out of 15 of your fields on one particular license clusters, we need to start having conversations about bidding those fields out to people who know what they want to do. Because if you have a cluster of 15 fields in one license and you're coming for a blanket approval, you're actually, shielding the prospect of development for the rest of the 11 fields. And so, this is some of the things that excite me, because I've heard the federal government say they're going for a 2024 bid round. What does that mean? It simply means that they are beginning to separate those fields that some of those companies are coming in clusters to renew their licenses for and not developing. That's one thing that is going to help our supply situation. And I say that because I've lost faith in some of the IOCs. They're already exiting Nigeria, so you cannot expect, the right answers from people that are leaving Nigeria when you're talking about expansion plans. Now, talking about, what was your other question? I think you were talking about logistics.
Yes.
And how it affects the cost.
Yes.
Right. Talking about logistics, it's a very big factor because, for example, if you look at a pie chart of all the cost factors that are interacting to determine our landing cost, let's give, for example, let me give you some numbers. You could see that the landing cost, for example, maybe of fuel exiting a refinery in the UAE or China could be at 340 naira. That's just an example on top of my head. And you will find out that a big component, almost 25 to 30% of the total cost is actually the ship that would bring it into Nigerian waters. And then you then have the storage in maybe a tank farm before you start distributing this product into the various reception centers for consumers. Now, the question is, if we have the right contractual agreements, that means that we have supply going to the Dangote refinery, for example, on a regular basis. The logistics is only going to be a fraction, and a day to say a 1/10 of the price of getting that ship perhaps from Port Harcourt somewhere or Escravos down to the Dangote refinery, dock.
In Lagos.
Is nothing compared to weeks of transporting the ship on the high sea and the Atlantic Ocean, depending on where you're coming from. So what am I trying to say is that the logistics in this case is going to be much lesser. We just need a more consistent supply situation. We just want to know and have the sense of comfort. And again, it is very important. I cannot state, I cannot overstate this fact that part of development of the downstream sector is hinged on the federal government giving confidence to investors. And confidence would come where they understand that you have a very clearly defined supply situation that would ensure that if they come in there, whichever place they want to invest in that value chain, that there will be supply. Some people may want to come and back even the supply itself. Remember that with the Nigerian Gas Transportation Network Code and some of the terms of the Petroleum Industry Act, we have actually succeeded in fleshing out the entire midstream sector. So the midstream sector is actually a fully fleshed out sector for which people can actually come in and profitably participate. We just need to fix some of those market frictions like the supply to ensure that it is very attractive for other people to come out and invest.
Okay. Now, there's a very fundamental part of this conversation before we wrap it up, Dr. Wisdom Enang. The issue of oil theft. The NNPC, in this particular situation, the headline that I talked about, it did talk about 112 cases of crude oil theft recorded in the Niger Delta region within 1 week. So this issue of oil theft is there. Whilst this continue unabated, don't you feel the issue of boosting our production capacity and regulating at some point pricing is going to be a bit of a problem?
It is a big problem, and I like to contextualize the point I put forward previously. That point is actually saying, well, we're having losses. We've tried our best. We're on the path to curbing, a significant amount of those losses. However, how do we even get past that stage where that creates a very huge dent to our economic plans? And this was what the basis on which what I was saying. Now, to address the problem of the crates. It's very sad. I mean, it's really sad that sabotage has become the order of the day. But I think part of taking ownership on the part of the community, host community, has a lot to do with equity and fairness. It has to do a lot with inclusion and inclusiveness in governance. And I think this is the charge to the federal government. People will take ownership of their properties in their community if they see that the framework of governance encompasses that fairness inside. What do I mean by that? You have, for example, mandates on the PIA from the host community bill aspect of the Petroleum Industry Act. How well are we implementing it? How well do these communities feel carried along? Is there a surveillance oversight on the implementation of the Petroleum Industry Act to ensure that people don't feel disgruntled? I've watched a couple of interviews from some of these, host community people that know, either they know those that are involved in bunkering, or they actually know they themselves get involved in it. And some of them are talking about the fact that they feel neglected. So I think the charge of this government is to understand that to solve this problem, they need to put a human face to governance, and that needs to be, put side by side with things like technology, as well as things like making sure that the host community provisions of the Petroleum Industry Act is implemented in a way that people feel that there's inclusive governance. Then people can take ownership, then people can see something and say something, and then we'll begin to record less of theft, the theft issues that we're currently reporting at the moment.
Dr. Wisdom, you've spoken well, but before I let you go, so that we conclude this conversation, what will be your advice? Because in 2023, you and I talked about the state of readiness of our refineries, because that also plays a role in this discussion. What would be your advice to the federal government in 2024, especially in addressing the issue of pricing?
My advice to the federal government would be simple. Pricing in itself is not an abstract, a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that is regulated by the supply situation. It's a phenomenon that is regulated by the foreign exchange situation. It's also a phenomenon that is regulated by an interplay between demand and supply. Now, what does that mean? Fix the supply situation. Let's get more of a long-term supply contract with penalties to penalize anybody that is not honoring that contract. That will give us confidence. The second thing is stabilize the exchange rate market. Good thing we are having inflows from, for example, the Afrexim Bank, other pledges from the World Bank. So we're expecting a lot of inflows between the first and the second quarter of 2024. That is something that we need to use to now fix the exchange rate market and ensure that there's a convergence on a price that we can actually use without the fear of volatility to do our price projections. And also, one of the ways by which we can get a very good equilibrium pricing between an interaction of demand and supply is to get more actors involved in the supply situation. Get more refineries up and coming, get more distributors across board, get more people in that sector, because right now the price is going on the increase even through the most conservative predictions, because the demand currently outweighs supply. I mean, you're talking about demand for more than 200 million people and supply from a few companies. So we need to boost that supply situation. We need to start extracting license, agreements for expansion of our production tied to the renewal of people's production licenses, upstream licenses. When you do that, and people can only get their license renewed if they prove to you that they have sort of maxed out on their expansion capacities at that material point in time, then we would have enough volumes to be able to feed the refineries, and by extension, we'll have a security of supply in the short term and modulation of pricing in the long term.
Dr. Wisdom Enang, oil and gas expert and a public affairs commentator, most thank you so much for your time, for providing insight into the situation between the NNPC and major oil marketers. We're hopeful that the advice you've provided will be used, especially at the corridors of power, to address the situation. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, having discussed the conversation thus far, the conversation was drawn from a headline on the Punch for today, where it talks about a situation between the NNPCL and marketers. You have that particular headline on your screen. NNPCL marketers clash over subsidy as operators peg at 1,200. So the federal government is doing everything possible to avert a situation that will further impoverish Nigerians, that will further create more hardship. And little wonder you're having this back and forth between the NNPCL and the marketers. Well, we must thank our expert, Dr. Wisdom Enang, for providing insight and perhaps some form of advice, some form of a solution, which they say is a low-hanging fruit. I hope that that advice, the analysis provided by him, can be used in addressing some of the fundamental issues that we have had with the oil and gas industry, so that the situation we're faced with Nigerians complaining daily about this pricing can be addressed. Thank you so much for being a part of the program. This is where we'll say thank you again. Join us again tomorrow as we discuss fundamental issues as they evolve on the Talking Point, because that's what we do. Whilst you do that, do all to follow us across our social media platforms, which you will see on your screen. Until I come your way again tomorrow, my name is Ikechukwu Jue. I'll leave with a prayer. God bless Nigeria, and a salute to you, the viewer. It's bye for now.
Let's talk security, current affairs, governance, politics, your view, elections, rule of law, economic issues, foreign events on the Talking Point. Talking Point, weekdays on this channel.